Thank you. A lot of you have seen images of this bird, the buller shearwater, today. I'm going to talk to you a bit more about work that we are doing with the Northern New Zealand Seabird Trust to try to better understand what's happening with buller shearwaters. Hopefully a lot of you have visited the Seabird Trust table in the back, but if you want more information about what I'm talking about today or other projects you've heard about, there's some resources for you to visit online as well. So buller shearwaters, you have heard from other people, are one of the 5 species of seabirds living in this Hauraki Gulf that are endemic to this region. They used to be called the New Zealand shearwater. For that reason, they're of immense prominence and importance to this area. We know that they are here, and a lot of you have seen them on the water. IUCN, for example, has given them a threat status of vulnerable. Under New Zealand classifications, they're considered to be at risk or uncommon. But the truth of the matter is that besides this, we really know very, very little about this species. We actually don't even have an accurate population estimate for them. There's been some guesses in the millions, but nobody has an idea of what the population is or what it's trending, if it's going up or down. In addition to this kind of lack of evidence of a biological study for this species, Graham Taylor, who is sort of New Zealand seabird treasure, Matt mentioned him, I think, earlier, spent some time on buller shearwater breeding colonies several years ago, and he made some interesting notes, and those notes turned out to be really valuable for what we know or how little we know about this species. But one of the critical things that he made note of was that buller shearwaters, some of these birds, while they were incubating eggs or provisioning chicks, were spending about 14 days away from their nest at a time. So this is a really long time for a chick, for example, to be going without food. But even more significant than that is that we have researchers in the past, so about 40, 50 years ago, saying that they were noting chicks gone for about 4 days from their nest, from chicks and from eggs. So it's a huge increase in time that's spent away from nests if what Graham's noted is actually widespread throughout the population. In addition to that, people that observe these birds on the ocean and at sea note that they often seem to rely on larger schooling fish to bring prey species to the surface. We know that buller shearwaters have the ability to dive deep, but like Brendan and Matt were talking about earlier, this is extremely energy costly, and they may just not be able to do that sustained. They may really require these schooling fish to bring their prey to the surface. And their populations and the trends of what they're doing, the conservation threats, are not only here in the Hauraki Gulf, which is really their home, but all over the Pacific and going up into the California current. So understanding what's happening with buller shearwaters is also helping us to understand what's happening in our greater Pacific area. So that brings me to a topic that somebody, a really wise gentleman, asked earlier about the effects of taking whole schools of fish out of the ocean. He specifically asked about purse seine fishing, which is what I've got a picture of here. And while buller shearwaters are not generally birds that are threatened terribly much by bycatch, we don't know what the effect of doing things like purse seine fishing and taking whole schools of these larger schooling fish out of the ocean. We don't know those effects on seabirds, particularly birds like buller shearwaters. And we're calling these kind of indirect effects of fisheries, but also there's the indirect effects of climate change on prey species, which you heard Steph talk about a little bit earlier. So again, these issues are extremely important, and buller shearwaters are a prime species to be able to study what could potentially be one of the most critical things threatening our ocean and our seabirds. And that brings me to what we've been doing at the Trust with buller shearwaters. And we started this project last year, and we're continuing it on this year. But that is to obtain an accurate population estimate for this species. We know from seeing them on the Gulf that they may seem very common. You may see a lot of them. You say tens or hundreds or thousands of them if you're out on your boat. But we also know from other seabirds like the red-billed gull, which also is seemingly a common species, that by actually getting an idea of the population and by looking at the trends of that population, species like the red-billed gull that seem common are actually really at risk. So I mentioned how special, and you've heard about how special Buller's shearwaters are for the Hauraki Gulf, but not only that, but this is a species that only nests on one island group in the Gulf, the Pornites Islands, way up north. They're extremely specialized to that region. They've not been known to breed anywhere else. The Pornites, many of you might have had the chance to visit if you're lucky enough, is made up of two large islands that you can see here. They're an extremely unique ecosystem, not only in the marine ecosystem, which is now protected and a very popular marine reserve, but on land as well. There's a high amount of endemism with plants and animals. But shaping a lot of that on land particularly is the presence of Buller's shearwaters and the footprint that they're having on those islands. So when we started gathering evidence for starting this project and talking to people who know the islands and know a bit about the birds, we were told by quite a lot of people that, there's Buller's shearwaters covering the Pornites, and that effect that they've had on the ecosystem there is really widespread, and we were told we might not be able to walk in parts of the island, which ended up being true in some places. But what we didn't know was how accurate that kind of vastness of their living on these islands was and what that meant for the population. So we set out to create a population estimate for Buller's shearwaters that could be repeated for as long into the future as possible. So what that included was looking at burrow density, how many of those burrows are occupied, and also using techniques that you've heard a little bit about, like acoustics and automated cameras, to get a better idea of the distribution and density of birds around the islands. We also wanted to start looking at that anecdotal evidence that Graham Taylor provided us about this difference in chick provisioning that he'd noted from the past, and if that's affecting chick success. So we started as well monitoring some permanent plots on one of the islands for looking at this in the future. And this was an extreme opportunity to be able to go spend weeks on the island. This really took a lot of manpower, and a lot of the people, the researchers and volunteers that spent time on the island are here actually, and we were so lucky to have them spending their time on the island, and a lot of them had expertise in many different fields that really helped make this project more successful. But you can see we spent time doing transects. This is Sandra Anderson on the bottom, making her way through very dense and unique habitat on the Pornites to look for burrow occupancy and vegetation, which this is on Tawhiti Rahi, which hadn't had researchers on it for many, many years. We also distributed recorders, you can see there, and we monitored chicks and burrows, and the chicks are, of course, extremely cute. Chick there. And we spent a lot of time navigating to random points across Tawhiti Rahi and identifying just how many burrows there were. Was it accurate what people told us before we started, that there's burrows everywhere? So we spent a lot of time navigating to these points and counting burrows. We also were able to observe what it's like to be on the Pornites while Buller's shearwaters are coming in at night. And what we found was just how magnificent this species is, but also how much we don't know about them. And hopefully you've gotten a chance to see this video a little bit, just playing in the back earlier. I'll cut that video off there because it goes on for a little while, but you've gotten a chance to feel what it's like to be on the Pornites, this magnificent seabird islands. But what we found, especially from doing these random plots across the island, was that in fact the burrow density isn't sustained everywhere you go. There aren't thousands of burrows in every place you touch. We definitely had locations where we had to crawl on our hands and knees to get through because of the density of burrows, but this map is showing the random plots we visited. In purple, you can see how many burrows were in a 6-meter diameter circle. That number, if it's purple, means there were any burrows there, but if there's a white circle, that means there was absolutely no Borough Shearwaters burrows around. So it ranged from a lot of locations where there's no burrows to up to 40 burrows. We also set up permanent plots to monitor chicks throughout the island in different habitats. And hopefully this is a way that we can continue to monitor what's happening with these seabirds. The question of how successful chicks are is really one that needs to be looked at over a multi-year kind of scope and get an idea of the trends that are happening throughout these different climatic changes and changes in the ocean. So we were able to cover over 2,000 meters squared of Tawhiti Rahi, which is the largest of the Poor Knights Islands. Again, we found a huge discrepancy in the number of burrows across the island. We did find that 51.7% of the burrows were occupied, but again, this is just a snapshot in time. And we're still working on this project. We're hoping in a few months to be going out to Aorangi, the other major island. But for our preliminary population estimate for this island is around over 100,000 breeding pairs. So definitely less even with the two islands combined than the millions that have been claimed by some people in the past. Sorry. So to go back to some of those questions we raised at the beginning, we need to know a little bit more about birds like Buller's shearwaters, not just because they're endemic to the Hauraki Gulf, not just because they live on these amazing islands in the north of the Gulf, but because they really are the way that we can get an idea of what's happening indirectly in the ocean through things like fishing, through taking those huge schools of fish out of the Gulf, not only here, but also in the North Pacific as well, but also climate change. We are hoping to continue this study to look at historical samples and isotopes from museums to be able to get an idea of if there's been a shift in diet, and also to get a better picture of what's happening with those provisioning shifts and chick success with Buller's Shearwater. So again, this project, last year we had so many amazing volunteers and researchers come out, but really a big thank you as well to Birds New Zealand and Ngāti Wai for allowing us to spend time on those amazing islands. Thank you.